Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth edition of Impact Matters, a monthly webcast with cutting-edge thinkers and change agents on the topic of impact. I'm Amy Hall, founder and president of Impactorum, a coaching and advisory service for sustainability and CSR professionals. And I'm also the vice president of social consciousness for Eileen Fisher. With me is Anela Dojsic, who's helping to facilitate this webcast. Anela?
Hi everyone, I'm Manella, and I'm going to be here today behind the scenes just helping manage the logistics and the Q&A. So before we start, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. Along the bottom of your screen, you should see both a chat and a Q&A function. If you are going to submit a question, just please do so through the Q&A. And we're going to hold about the last 15 minutes to answer as many questions as we can live. Otherwise, throughout the webinar, please feel free to use the chat function if you want to connect and discuss with anyone else that is on the webinar. Just one thing to mention about the chat is right now your default setting is set to send your messages only to all panelists. So before you send your message, you're going to actually want to change that so it says all panelists and attendees, and you can do that right when you open the chat box. So yeah, that's it for me, and I will catch up with you guys later on in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Anela. So now I'd like to introduce today's guest. I met Philip McKenzie through a monthly discussion and networking group called Creating a Better World, or as Philip later described it to me, that Friday morning call. Philip is a self-described anthropologist strategist. He uses his expertise in culture spaces to advise organizations on how to best thrive in an increasingly challenging and uncertain environment. Philip is also a former trader for Goldman Sachs. He today designs and curates the Influencer Conference. He hosts his own podcast called The Deep Dive. He's a DJ called Nine is Water, and he's just been named Executive Director of AdvancingDiversity.com. We'll be placing links to these and other references in the chat box throughout the webcast. And also, somehow he's finding time to write his first book, There Are No Shortcuts, The Revolutionary's Guide to the Future. Okay, I'm gonna see if I can unmute. And Anela, if you wouldn't mind bringing Philip's video and
I'm here.
There we go. There he is.
I'm ready to go.
I'm so delighted, Philip, that you found a little time to spend with us today, and welcome to Impact Matters.
It's my pleasure. I'm so happy to be here. I'm grateful for everyone who's decided to take the time to join, to listen to us have this conversation. So I'm ready to rock. Answer me anything. Let's do it.
Excellent. Oh my gosh, your enthusiasm is contagious. So there may be a few people listening who know you personally, but for those who don't, I just wonder, I'd like to set a little context about who you are and maybe so people understand why I invited you to chat today. One of the things that most fascinated me about you when I met you, and I really have only met you a couple of times, is your transition from the financial industry to cultural anthropology. These two careers seem kind of diametrically opposed to each other, and I just wondered if you wouldn't mind sharing how and why you followed that path.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the fact that they do seem diametrically opposed is part of the conversation, because in reality, I think we've spent too much time in our lives thinking in terms of silos. And, you know, I went to business school, went to do Fuqua School of Business, you know, and I was focused on getting a job in financial services. I wanted to work at Goldman specifically. So I was a summer there. I was intensely focused on getting that job. And I think looking back on my life then, and I would probably make the argument that most professional schools are still this way, people are very focused on getting a set of skills that are going to get them a particular job in a particular industry and sort of track that way. What happened to me in my journey as I sat on the trading desk, and keeping in mind a trading desk is a very specific type of work environment, unlike most other corporate work environments. So there's a lot of nuance to that job specifically. But nonetheless, just thinking about it generally, I just started thinking, is this my best purpose? Is this what I'm meant to be doing with my life is I kind of would go in there every day and have the 3-4 monitors around me, very matrix-like existence. And I made the personal decision that that wasn't where my best purpose was going to be, and decided to explore other things. And part of that diametrically opposed way of thinking at things is that, you know, I had a number of different interests. I viewed the world in a particular way, and what I would offer is that, given the challenges that we are facing as a society, it is really generalist, you know, if to use that term, that are best poised to solve our problems. You know, I think specific remedy is less effective, and my career has been now one that tracks more toward building deep and wide relationships, wide expertise across areas. You know, it's a way of embracing complexity that was different from what I did when I was at Goldman Sachs.
So there's so much in that. I really love that you said generalists are best poised to solve the world's problems, because I see myself as a generalist, so that gives me hope. But I also, it's really fascinating to me that this idea of moving from siloed thinking to sort of more holistic thinking, and if you want to extrapolate further, just this idea of systems thinking, right? And how I think so many people don't think that way, right? We kind of go down a rabbit hole. We get really specialized. We know what we do well at work, and we forget to tie the loose ends together across the organization. And so I love that you are reminding us about the importance of that. And I think I want to get into that in a little bit when we talk about what is actually going on in the world. And before we do that, I really love to talk about, since we're here to talk about culture, what is your definition of culture? You had shared a definition with the group that I mentioned earlier, which was really short: a shared world of ideas and values that connect us in places. And I wondered if that's still how you would define it, or, you know, if you'd like to elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, that definition, it also includes informal and formal ways in which we operate, you know, because again, culture it's something like, it's like water and like oxygen. It's something that we are born into and affects us in ways that are largely invisible, or at least intangible. So I use that type of terminology a lot in my work, because oftentimes we're focused on the tangible things. Those are part of the current story that we tell ourselves. It's a very industrial age story. And the intangible things are really where there's a lot of power, and culture is one of those intangible, invisible things. And it acts on us formally and informally. You know, those that are in organizations, we know there's the formal way in which there's reporting, there's the formal way in which your job is done, there's organizational charts, there's mission statements, there's statements of purpose, there's PR, there's all of these things that go toward the way in which an organization works, that they would define as their culture. But then we also know that there are informal ways in which that culture operates as well. There's whisper networks, there's power that's held within certain places that are not on the organizational chart. And that's how culture really operates. You know, there's this movement, this flow between the formal and the informal. And it's important for us, I think, to recognize that. There's a resume, right? If you look at my bio, you look at my resume, and all of us have these things. There's schools that I went to, there's institutions that I'm a part of, you know, that have impacted and shaped who I am. But then there's informal things that have shaped who I am too. There's my family, there's living and growing up in Brooklyn at a particular time in a particular place. All of those are parts of a larger whole. So that's how I think about culture, and kind of pull those things apart when I do my work inside organizations.
I wonder if you could talk a little, just give a simple example of what you might do when you go into an organization maybe a challenge that they might ask you to address and what you might do, because especially when you talk about those informal networks, the whisper network, that's kind of like the water cooler conversations, right?
Absolutely.
And yeah, so how do you get at some of that when you're working inside an organization?
Yeah, I have a process. It's a cultural forensics process, and it's just what I call it to, when I'm talking to organizations and pitching and doing my work, it's a way of putting a label on something. But at its core is really a curiosity. It's, I'm though very comfortable with the quantitative stuff. My approach probably is far more qualitative, right? It's based in ethnography. It's based on, asking a lot of questions, pulling apart those formal networks and trying to understand what's really going on within an organization. Every organization has a different set of challenges, but at their root, it's all about people. And if you're dealing with people, you're dealing with culture. So to a certain extent, I always advance that I'm industry agnostic, because it doesn't really matter what the product is or what the service is. It's still people, whether they're internal to the organization or external to the organization. Is it a human being that you have classified as a consumer of your product or service, or is it the human being that sits inside the organization that makes all of that go? Either way, you're still talking about people. So my goal is to really walk in and make a deeper inquiry as to, if you're faced with a challenge, is that challenge accurate? Oftentimes a lot of organizations identify that they have a challenge, and then when you start asking more questions, that's really not the challenge at all. Or the challenge is a little bit more complex than might have been the initial, inquiry that kind of led to me being involved in the first place. So it's really digging into that as part of how I think about the work.
Okay, so moving from a business, inside four walls of a business, to kind of what's going on in the world, we are dealing with the pandemic. We're dealing with the very divisive political parties, at least in this country. We're dealing with financial disparity. We're dealing with wildfires. We're dealing with a hurricane. We're dealing with racial injustice, police brutality. I mean, it goes on. And so, the natural inclination, I guess, is to say, okay, how can we solve one thing? And I would imagine that what we're really talking about is what's the connective tissue between all of these, and how do we get at that? And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today, is taking your experience inside companies and extrapolating it, applying it to kind of what's going on in the world. First of all, when you think about the challenges that we're facing and what I just named, does that feel kind of right to you, or do you feel like there's something else you'd want to add to that list?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the list is long. I think if both of us were endeavoring to sit here and just list the problems, we'd be doing this really all day. We would need a lot more than an hour to go through those problems. I think what you've identified is, and how I think about these things is, they are roots of probably, or extensions of probably one large problem. And then everything that you've highlighted, and I'm sure our listeners could probably highlight even more, and all of us as we sit here today can kind of list more and more. They're just kind of tributaries of larger problems, larger stories that we've told ourselves and reinforced to ourselves, that are millennia old, that we need to shift.
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the things that I wanted to ask is whether you think that these are actually new problems, or is the volume of the problems new, or are they really the same things we've been dealing with for generations? We just know about them more because we have more access to information and social media, etc.
Yeah, I think they are the same, but yet different. In the sense that, I use a lot of natural analogies and metaphors, because we are, natural human beings connected to this ecology, right? So what I try to do very intentionally is to use language in these environments that invite a different way of framing these challenges. And so if you think about a river, you know, there's the metaphor or that says, you know, you can't stick your foot in the same water twice, right? In a running river. And it's the same thing with these problems. They're going to be different in the different moments in which we face them, but they're still going to be somewhat the same when you get to the root cause, right? Water is water as a chemical thing. It doesn't change, but the flow of it becomes different. So yeah, these problems are long in their history.
Does that mean that we don't really, that things are never going to change? They're just going to stay the way they are? Do you feel like there's any hope?
No, there's lots of hope, right? Hope comes with activism. I don't think that prescribing or listing or knowing and realizing problems means that one is not hopeful. In a way, I think when we anchor questions around optimism or this notion of optimism, it's in a way kind of taking us away from realizing where we are in this current moment. And yeah, things are serious, and I think it's fair to assess them in that way. Yes, there've always been challenges with this industrial age story. Things do get better, but progress is not linear. And so to kind of use a business analogy, when people think about Wall Street, you know, they'll often say, right, that when you look at a stock price, that past results does not imply future returns. So just because a stock went up yesterday doesn't mean that it'll go up today. In the same way, if you think about our society, just because we had the Emancipation Proclamation and we've had Voting Rights Act and we've had women given the right to vote, and that we've had, you know, LGBTQ communities that have improved with, you know, marriage equality and all those kind of things, just because we've had those things happen in the past, it doesn't mean that that same progress will continue in the future, nor does it mean that they are not, you know, highly organized forces aligned that have a different picture, right? That they are just as invested in their perspective of the world as many of us are invested in a different perspective. So this is a constant challenge that we have to face together, while also being optimistic and hopeful. The fight continues.
So you had mentioned at some point kind of, oh, these are extensions of one large problem, right? And I wrote down a quote from a woman that I have a lot of respect for. Her name is Ra Goddess. I don't know if you know her.
She spoke at my conference many years ago.
She did.
So yes.
She's one of my favorite people. And she said recently that, I think I was listening to her on a podcast, money is God. Everything works in service of dominance, greed, and exploitation. I'm not going to dwell on the negative for the rest of this conversation, but, and I wondered, you know, so she's describing that as kind of the root. It's very similar to money is the root of all evil, now that I think about it. But that because we're you know, business just needs to make more money. Our president, you know, you can think of a million examples where money and greed and being self-serving kind of just keeps driving these problems forward. And I wondered if you see that is that really the root cause, or is there something else that you could identify?
Yeah, I think there is a story, and it's an industrial age story. It's a story that focuses on ownership. It focuses on extraction, and it focuses on exploitation. And some of those traits are packaged as being net positives, right? The idea of survival of the fittest. You know, these are all parts of the mythologies that we've grown up with. And I'll only use an American context to frame these examples, or a Western world way of framing them, because Darwin his work is not just in the United States, right? But, his work is taken to say, hey, you know what? Survival of the fittest. We're in a state of competition. And so the winners are the ones who competed and the losers are those who didn't, right? This idea of manifest destiny, right? That, go west, young man. We'll look out onto, the Western horizon, and everything on that horizon is there to be taken and to be used. We can list any number of examples like that. But again, when you start to pull away the essence of those stories, they're those mythologies that we tell ourselves to reinforce a certain set of values. When you look at it, the natural world does not work in a state of competition, right? The natural world works in a state of cooperation and harmony, So that's just how it is, right? Manifest destiny perpetuates, colonial settlerism and white supremacy. These were lands that people existed on, right? It was not land that was just empty, but the idea reinforces this. And so the removal of those people in service to that story starts to make sense. We talk about Adam Smith with The Wealth of Nations without also recognizing that he wrote the moral sentiments, talking about how we should live a life that's based in value and morality, not just the invisible hand of the marketplace. So these are all stories and mythologies, and we can challenge them and also create new ones that are more accurate toward living a healthier life that's in balance.
Okay, great. I like that. So as I think about moving forward, which is really the whole point here, what can we do to act together to create a movement of change? You wrote a lovely piece for medium.com called Leaning into Love. And you have a statement there, love must be a principle upon which radical change is manifested. And I wondered if you'd like to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, my use of language is very intentional, which is very annoying to many people who know me. But love is this notion that's become commercialized, right? Like when people think about love, it's used to sell product. It's used for, anniversaries and Zales and, Valentine's Day and all of these things. So we're often anchored in this idea of love as a commercial thing and a romantic thing, romantic as tied to that monetary exchange. But love is a organizing idea around our societies. It's as a agape, which is a term I use a lot, is this more communal sense of love. So as a
how do you spell agape?
AGAPE.
Okay.
As a organizing idea of radical change, it has to be centered in love. And I also would throw justice in there as well, but all of these are terms that support one another. Compassion, love, justice, as organizing principles. So I think the notion of thinking about the world in that way is radical relative to the way in which we usually think about it, right? It ties back to when we started this conversation talking about tangible versus intangible things, this notion that, it's only the things that we can touch that matter. And I always offer that is the intangible things, is the invisible things that matter the most. When I was in Moscow last year, roughly around this time, I was speaking at a digital marketing conference and talking about these ideas, and there was a Q&A live in the hall, and a young man got up and we started talking about like data and measuring things. And he was like, I love these ideas. They sound so great, but, how do I put a number to this? Like, how do I know that it's really a thing? These notions. And I asked him a very simple question. I said, that's a fair question to ask. I'll ask you a question in response because I think it will answer your question. Have you ever been in love with someone? And he said, yeah, of course. And I was like, well, how did you know that? Was there some measurement to it? Was there some tool to it? Is there a number that you can attach to it? Like, how did you know that? He was like, I just knew it. And that's the most powerful thing in the world. It doesn't matter that you can't measure it. You know it, you feel it. And all of these things we know and we feel. And we need to move away from a story that tells us to disregard our feelings for some other idea of what rational is, right? Because it can be measured. And that's not really how our lives work. Not when you really start thinking about it. Everything that can be measured doesn't matter. And I'm stealing that from Einstein. So that's not mine.
Okay. Okay, so coming from a numbers guy, financial guy, to hear you say that numbers don't matter, and that I think I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but the things that really matter can't be measured, right? You can't even touch or feel them, physically, because they're intangible. That's kind of a radical statement. And yet also, just to further extrapolate, if we think about all the chaos in the world today, how does love apply to all those crazy things that we named earlier? How do you use love to heal, today's woes?
Yeah, again, I think it tells a different story, right? If you're driven by love and compassion and you're centering justice, it's impossible to have a world that doesn't work for almost everybody. They're incompatible notions, right? But when you say to people that, oh, if only we can do X, if we only had the money, right? Or if we can only afford to do it. But yet in pandemic, we've realized that these notions that people would say are tangible notions like money, they don't exist. Like they're the things that are made up. Like money is an agreement between you and me that it means something, right? Like it's not even, when we were on the gold standard where it was at least attached to a piece of metal that was pulled out of the ground that we said because it's shiny has value, right?
Yeah.
Money doesn't even have that anymore. It's literally full faith. Like our money doesn't say anything but full faith and credit of the United States government. It only means something because people believe that the government says it means something. So once you take away that notion and really start to ask the hard question and say, like, why do I believe in this stuff in the first place? I can imagine something different because everything that we have that exists, we created it. These are not natural rules. These are not physical rules of how the universe works. It's not gravity. The economic system, the political system, the social systems that we have designed are created here. So we can create something else. So if we want to organize around saying it doesn't make sense for us to have a world where people are homeless or people don't have food or people don't have education or people don't have the right to healthcare and access to healthcare and access to education, we can do that. It's only through this rational notion, so-called rational notion of what we can afford that prevents us from doing that. Because the minute you start to put those things on the table, people argue them by economics. Well, how are we going to pay for that? How are we going to get the money to do that? It's very rarely an argument around what's right, right? Like no one says, yeah, kids shouldn't have a good education. The counter argument is never that it shouldn't be that. The counter argument is only that how are we going to afford it? And to me, that's a false argument because we can afford anything because none of it matters in the first place.
Oh my God. Yeah, you're right. And we live in the world we live in, and you know there are very few places in the world, I would say, probably anymore that don't rely on some kind of physical money, right? So, is it possible for us to decouple ourselves from what we've all known for centuries? You know, to be our current truth. How do we reach? How do we get there? How do we start to change the tide?
I mean, people are doing it all the time, right? Like
Yeah.
these are activities that are happening all around us where people are deciding to live their life in different ways. You know, there are co-ops, there's unions, there's organizing to demand, you know, a different way forward, to say that, you know, I have the right to organize, I have the right to, you know, a fair pay, I have a right to benefits. The fact that we no longer, at least in the United States, for the most part, we don't have 6-year-olds working in factories that with closed windows, and we have weekends, you know, we have holidays. All of that was based off of the organizing principles that we can have a better way of doing things. And it's the same thing today, right? We had, you know, the end of slavery in this country in 1865. We had a few years where things were potentially going in a different direction during Reconstruction. Then we had another 100 years of Jim Crow. You know, then we had something different. We lived in a time when even interracial relationships were illegal, you know, so anything can be changed, you know, including these organizing principles around our economy and our social structures. So, and people are doing that. Like, people are fighting to change the ways in which all of this works. You know, not all of them are getting press, not all of them are parts of big foundations, but many of those organizations are just agents of the status quo anyway. They're not really about change, you know? So I think we need to move away from this story of like change is going to come from like this really big thing, and start to enact change in so many small ways around us.
In everyday actions.
Yeah, everyday actions, you know. Yeah. The fact that we are organizing and doing this event, you know, is an example of that type of change. Is an exchange between the two of us because we care, you know, and that's meaningful. You know, the people who are listening, they chose to opt in because they care. And all of these are important ways in which we can change this.
So I'm involved in a group called it's a peer circle. It's possible one of my co-peer circle members is listening in, and we just had we speak every month, and we've been doing so for, I think it's about 9 years now. I mean, it's crazy. There's 6 of us who agreed to do this. And the conversation we had yesterday, I'm not going to reveal any names or anything, but there were some lovely examples of what you just described. Somebody who had to leave, she's on the West Coast and had to leave where she lives because of the smoke, and went to a fairly expensive hotel because that was the one she had to go to get away from the smoke. And she had a kind of a friend just randomly contribute a fair amount of money towards her hotel stay because they knew it would help her get through this situation. And there had been no ask, and of course a tremendous amount of gratitude for it. And then there's another member who's talking about eco-communities and trying to see if we can figure out a way to build more of those. And I think that's a little bit of what you're describing in a more utopian situation, more concrete, concentrated situation where people agree to live a certain way within some boundaries. And there are many examples of those around the world. And so, and I think though what you're also saying is we can live this way in the structures that we have now. We don't have to move. We don't have to, give up all our worldly possessions. But that if we just shift our mindset a little bit, maybe a lot.
Yeah, it's a different way of approaching things. And I tell, like, you brought up Influencer Conference. I produced that for many years, and this was something where I didn't have a lot of money. I didn't have a lot of resources to just throw money at a problem and say, oh, okay, I'm going to hire people in these cities. We co-created that. We worked on it together. It was a function of radical transparency. Every team in every city knew what everybody else was doing. We knew what the money was, where the money was going. Some cities sold tickets for this. I remember my Mumbai team, the first year we did it, we offered, I forgot what the charge was, but they came to me and they said, hey, you know what? We want to do a gift economy. People can give what they want. They can provide services. They can do other things in order to participate. We think it'll be better for the community. And I said, go for it, right? Do whatever you think is best. And the team made more money the second year without having those things in place. Like, there's so many alternative ways in which we can choose to organize. And some of that are these small acts, small only in the sense that they might be one-to-one, but giving of ourselves, sharing of what we have. Those things are the things that we've known and learned since we were kids. There's no reason why those things should be invalid now that we are adults.
So it brings to mind for me the Bhutan example of the gross national happiness. And, it got a lot of press when people started hearing about it, and it's kind of quieted down now. But I wonder how necessary you think it might be for example, for our national economic system to shift to something like that, to radically shift away from its current model, which really emphasizes this idea of, you can only measure your success by how much money you have. In order to really see this kind of sense of shared love and shared community really flourish, can we do it within the existing structures, power structures and dynamics, or do we need to kind of shift more towards a Bhutan model?
Yeah, we need to shift. This is not working, on almost any level. This is not working. And the cost of it not working, I think, is evident everywhere. We see, like you referenced, out on the West Coast, West Coast is on fire. What's going to be the cost of that? If those who want to focus on the economics, like, what's the cost of continuing on the path that we are on? I think is immeasurable. Whatever the cost is of doing something different, it is less than the cost of doing the same, because there is no magic bullet. I know that's another one of these, like, techno-utopian stories that we've sold ourselves over the past few decades, but Silicon Valley has no answers. There is no flying car. There is no magical thing that's going to clean the water. There is no magical thing that's going to clean the air. All of that is complete and utter nonsense. So, given the fact that it's obvious that so much of this is crumbling around us, we should be looking and engaging in doing something different instead of kicking the can down the road, hoping that, like, oh, Tesla's going to do something. And, the Gates Foundation is going to do something. They are not. So disabuse yourself of that notion and demand a better way forward and co-create it.
Yeah, yeah. I just want to remind folks who are listening, if you have a question or comment, throw it in the Q&A and we'll get to it in a few minutes. And so if you were to say something to, and maybe you have, I don't know, to our rulers in this country in particular, I had to bring it up. I really don't want to be political, but I can't stand it. I can't help it. What would you say? What would you say to try to persuade people to think differently? Think in the way that you're describing.
Yeah, there's nothing to say to those people.
Okay.
they're already entrenched in the way in which they think, and you know, they're focused on extraction. You know, they're focused on power for power's sake, and so there is no persuadable argument to be had there. I think those who need to be persuaded, you know, are just regular people, you know. But I think most regular people feel that way, right? Changes only ever come from regular people. You know, like, doesn't matter who the regular person is, they've only become extraordinary in hindsight, right? Like, it doesn't, you know, I could go through the list and name them all, right? Like, if you want to say like Martin Luther King, right? Like, he was murdered and he wasn't, his favorable ratings weren't high when he was alive, right? It's only now that we mythologize people, right? And so we have the holiday, you kind of got to go for it. I mean, I remember when Martin Luther King Day wasn't even a national holiday, right? Like, Arizona refused to do it, right? It was a famous Public Enemy song, By the Time I Get to Arizona, right? And fighting against this. So yeah, it's great to have the commercials, but in reality, he's a regular person. He was 25 years old when he started the Montgomery boycott movement. And he came into a movement that already existed. He didn't start it. So we got to get out of this idea that like there's going to be one solution. Like, people are everywhere fighting around these issues, you know, not to get political, but I'm always political because politics is just the way in which we organize our society. If people are watching the news with, you know, these forced sterilizations that has kind of come out, one person brought that story out, right? Just a person who said, I cannot stand by and listen to this happen or watch this happen. That person's not the head of an organization. I don't know anything about them other than they are a person on the right side of history, right? They decided that it was not enough for them to have a seat at a table if that table is by its core immoral. And that's all that matters. Each of us every day can make those same calculations and decisions. You know, we have the power to say we're going to do one thing versus another, you know, and that gives me an incredible amount of hope. You know, the same problems we created, we can solve them.
And there's something about you feel it in here when you know it's the right thing to do. That's pretty straightforward.
Absolutely.
There are a couple folks being named in the chat box, the Ella Baker leaderless movements, Angela Davis.
Yeah, warriors.
2 examples, yeah.
Right,
yeah.
And we are filled with them. You know, Fannie Lou Hamer. You know, we can go on and on and on. You know, James Baldwin. You know, an essay of his that I refer to a lot. He talks about this notion of it's the invisible things, right? It's invisible, the connections that we have to one another. But what can be more real than that? Nothing at all. You know, there's no building that is more of a monument than the compassion that we should have between one another. That's the most powerful monument that there is, because all those other monuments turn to dust. but we persist, right? So that's what we need to cling to and build off of. So for those people that run the government for now, you know, their time's up.
Yeah, we hope.
You know,
Yeah.
their time is up no matter what. I'm not even talking about the election. I'm saying their
Yeah.
mentality,
Yeah.
those types of people, their time is up. That I
Yeah.
have full confidence of.
I'll drink to that.
Yeah, definitely. Water for now.
I think we have one question. Anela, do you want to jump in with that one? And then I have some more thoughts to share with Philip.
Yes, a great one. Frederick Douglass said that it is easier to build strong children than repair broken men. How do we influence the informal culture, the water and the oxygen, to promote value and morality at the earliest stages to develop strong leaders for our future?
Yeah. I'm not going to argue with Frederick Douglass. But I might offer another side to that, in that, yes, we should always be building a culture that is healthy for everybody participating. Obviously, children, right? They learn from us as adults, both formally and informally, right? Like I said at the beginning, there's academics and school and all of those things, and then there's their parents, there's friend groups that are informal, there's extended family, there's TV, right? There's any number of things that kind of give us lessons, both formal and informal, and all of those things should be geared toward making responsible people, right? The part that I'll throw another thing in, the broken man, and I know he's, at the time, men was just the thing. I'm sure in his mind that's a genderless assumption. So I'll address it in that same way. You know, all of us have the ability for redemption. So yes, it might be easier to engender certain ideas from the time people are young, but it's never too late for people to come to ideas and a way of living that supports both themselves and their community. So the work of it might be more difficult, but the redemption of it is absolute, right? We always have that capacity to tell a different story. It's the reason why people like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, just to throw out another name, has been an abolitionist for prisons, you know, which is difficult work to do because we've been programmed in such a way to think about our criminal justice system in only one particular way. And so when someone offers something that's different, that's tied so much to abolition, it becomes harder, right? But that person is wrestling with ideas around restorative justice. Like, what does it look like to truly center justice in our society? So I think that quote at the time doesn't quite capture all of that, but I think there's room for us to help the youngest of us, children, which is where the quote started, but also help all of us, no matter where we are in our journey, from 4 to 45 to 55 and on and on and on. Not easy, but definitely doable.
So, you know, thinking how to word this question, I think a lot of what you describe that, you know, we should be taking action around will take us out of our comfort zones, each of us as individuals, because we're kind of, you know, set in our way. We have our little community that we're used to. We have our friends. How have you approached this? I'm going to turn it back to you. Just maybe you can give us an example of how you have maybe gone above and beyond to exemplify this compassion that you're describing.
Yeah. I don't know if it's above and beyond, but I'm constantly and perpetually curious, which can also be, again, annoying to people. But, you know, it's just a reality of how I am. And, you know, because these notions of compassion and love have become so important to me, I try to always frame an issue through that lens. I constantly try to ask myself, like, why am I uncomfortable? If I'm uncomfortable with something, why am I uncomfortable with it? What is it about this thing that's causing me to feel that way? And if it's, even if I don't always understand something, I'm gonna try to fall down on the, do no harm, right? Like, whatever my angst might be with something, I gotta work that out. I can't work that out at the expense of another human being. So it roots me in a place of compassion automatically. And so I try to just constantly do that. I cannot make my existence an impediment to someone else's. That is just antithetical to how I want to live my life. Which is why I don't argue with people who don't see things the way I do, right? It's kind of like, go forth and prosper, but I don't have to engage with you. That's another one of those notions that we feel we always have to be engaging. Like, you don't have to engage. It's okay to not do that. Even though people would say, oh, we've got hearts and minds, we've got to change it. It's like, no, you don't have to do that at all. Right? So yeah, I don't know if that's a perfect answer, but it's kind of the answer, a answer.
Yeah, I like that. Thank you. I want to see if, Anela, was there another question in the Q&A before I wrap up?
Yeah, we have a new one. In the last 5 years, what new belief, behavior, or habit has most improved your ability to be a positive force for change?
I don't know if I say there's something new. It's just constant reinforcement of the same. Once I got out of like a corporate environment, like working there day to day, it was always about living this life to the fullest potential and opportunity that I can. So everything that crosses like my desk or my inbox or whatever thing it is, I think about, is this serving like me, not as an individual, but me as an extension of what I want to see birthed into the world, right? If it's a project that doesn't align with my values, then I won't take it. If it's spending time on something that is not worth my time, I won't do it, right? Because I value these experiences too much, right? Like, there's no dress rehearsal for this. This is the only life that we have. And it should be used as effectively as it can be, which doesn't mean that it's going to be good all the time, right? Because that's, again, that happiness idea that people get sold. Even within struggle, you can find joy. So I want to have a life that's filled with that. Within the ups and downs, it's just a good balance. So there's not really new habits. It's just to be open to things and reject those models that don't serve me.
Words to live by. You are an amazing example of how we should try to live our lives. Thank you so much for that inspiration.
Thank you. You're too kind.
Do you want to share anything about what's coming up for you? Any events or? I think you just published a podcast, for example.
Yeah, I won't plug too much because I didn't come into this to kind of plug.
I know.
But if folks want to engage with the deep dive, feel free to do so. I think there's a lot of conversations on there that are inspiring. I got a lot of stuff in the bank that's coming that I know is really great. Conversations that are just very touching and emotional to me. So maybe new listeners or current listeners will find some value in some of those conversations. So obviously I invite everybody to do that. I'm pretty much an open book, so feel free to connect with me if you so choose. You can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter and all that kind of stuff. And other than that, more so find each other. open to all those invisible, intangible things that are in your life that are important, and lean into them and hold them close, because those are the things that will matter more so than anything else that's tangible. So that's it. That's all.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you, Philip McKenzie,
Thank
for
you.
your wisdom and your very extraordinary high positive energy and the hope that you give us. And thank you, Anela, for helping with the logistics. Thank you, everyone, for showing up. And there will be, this along with all of these are recorded and are put on YouTube. So I'll send the link out eventually, one of these days. The next episode will be on October 22nd with a friend and former consultant, a sustainability systems consultant, Sarah Chalet. We're going to talk about a key milestone in Eileen Fisher's sustainability journey. So for anybody who's interested in that, I think that'll be a good one. And I just want to invite everybody to open our hearts and build something new together. Thank you all.